Welcome back, and welcome to part 3. This final part of our walk around Great Asby takes us from Marble Mill away in the top right, back to the Three Greyhounds Inn close to the centre of the screen, and then we'll spend a little time in the church. We ended part 2 by thinking ahead to the rather complicated process of trying to understand the management of water power in this part of the villagescape, starting here at Marble Mill. For the moment, let's shift our gaze a little west and open a document. This is a translation and summary of what is probably a mid to late 12th century charter, which leased the manor of Asby-Winderworth to the medieval hospital of St. Peter, later St. Leonard, in York. We first encountered this institution's association with the village in part 1. One of the conditions set down in this charter is that the hospital's 8 tenants in the manor of Asby-Winderworth, their men, as it states in the middle of line 3, were to help to make the mill pond. Those last words are at the end of line 4. There is very little documentary evidence about the mill pond across the centuries, but 700 years or so later, in the 1840s, the parish tithe map that was drawn up then does show an unmistakable mill pond. Let's take a look at the position of that. The shape and location of that mill pond has been roughly drawn on this Google Earth view. It was about 200 yards long, 182 metres or thereabouts, and about 30 yards, just over 27 metres, wide. And it was clearly located within the boundary of Asby-Winderworth Manor. We can also go back to see the pond on an annotated screenshot of the tithe map. Unfortunately, the map is a little messy, as our location is right at the edge of what is now a rather fragile map. You can see its ragged edge. You can see the Tithe Commission surveyor's grey rectangle depicting Marble Mill towards top right of the screenshot I've superimposed on the Google Earth image. The pond appears to have occupied a widened area of the channel of Asby Beck. There is a narrower channel running along the length of the mill pond and slightly south of it. The pink line drawn along that channel by the Tithe Commission surveyors represents the boundary between Asby-Winderworth and Asby-Coatsford Manors. This shows, as I've said, that the pond was within the manor of Winderworth. This narrower channel may have been a safety feature added later in the life of the mill pond to carry water from the pond to a point on Asby Beck, located below the site of what I believe was a weir and sluice, used to control and manage the power of the water. More on them and my notes written on this screenshot in a moment. One note of caution. We can't be sure that what we're looking at on a map drawn in 1843 is the same as the arrangement that was constructed here in the 12th century. But let's look at more of the features on the map, which I'll try to explain through my added notes. First, a truncated channel, which I've labelled in black font as First Channel, running from the eastern end of the pond. Then a second channel, a little to the right of the first, which runs towards the south gable of Marble Mill. This second channel continues eastwards. We saw at the end of part 2, when talking about the bark mill at Mill Moor, that the continuation of this second channel is still visible on the ground today. It carried water beyond Mill Moor to drive a corn mill located at a site which is still known as Asby Mill. But, and this may be important, that corn mill, Asby Mill, was 900 yards or more, over 820 metres, from this pond. Was that a deliberate plan in order to achieve the fall to obtain the required power to drive the mill? Or might it be evidence that at some point the corn mill had been re-sited and the long mill race constructed to link the earlier mill pond to the new site of the mill at the place now known as Asby Mill. Let's hold that question for the moment and look again at that truncated channel, the one I've marked here as first channel. It seems to be important, or to have once been important, located as it is at the apex of the mill pond, almost as if it was the focus of the purpose of that pond. It appears to be directed towards the site of the present-day Marble Mill. The first edition of the Ordnance Survey map seems to show this alignment even more clearly than does this tithe map. There appears to be no evidence today of any sluice structure that might have controlled the flow of water into this first channel. We'll come back to this screen. After that 12th century charter, which we considered a few moments ago, the one which refers to making the mill pond, there is no further record of an Asby Winderwath mill until an inquest held in Penrith in 1401. This inquest heard evidence about the date of the baptism in 1380 of the heir to the lordship of the manor, a Christopher Moresby, in order to establish whether he, Christopher, had now reached the age of majority and could take back the manor from the Crown, which had been holding it since the death of his father, and here is a short excerpt from the record of proceedings. One of the witnesses at this inquest, Robert de Grindesdale, stated that he remembered the day of the baptism because on that very same day the mill of Winanderwath, that's one earlier form we find for the place name Winderwath, was carried away in a great flood. My conjecture is that the first corn mill of the manor of Asby Winderwath was located relatively close to the eastern end of the mill pond shown on screen here, perhaps near to the site of that house known today as Marble Mill, labelled just above the text box. And it was this first corn mill which was carried away by a great flood in 1380. The surviving name of the farmstead, Mill Moor, do you remember that, which is much closer to Marble Mill than it is to the conjectured relocation site, now called Asby Mill, may be another clue that the first corn mill was close to the site of the building now known as Marble Mill. This first corn mill probably also gave its name to nearby open common land, making it known as Mill Moor, later to become the site of the farmstead of that name. Now to another screenshot, which is probably far too busy, but try to stay with me. As I've already indicated, I believe that after that great flood of 1380, a new corn mill was built on what was regarded as a safer site, further downstream at what is now known as Asby Mill, and a new, long mill race was constructed to carry water to it. Here I'm showing that relocation site, some distance downstream. There, just right of top centre, is the site of what was Asby Mill, right through later medieval, early modern and modern times. Running from our mill pond, there bottom left in this screenshot and going past Marble Mill, I've marked as a broken yellow line the 900 yards, 820 metres of mill race, connecting the old mill pond to the relocated mill. The line of Asby Beck is pointed to, further right, by blue arrows. Let's go back for a moment to look at more detail around the mill pond, using the annotated extract from the tithe map. The pond holding the water to drive this first mill was, as I've already pointed out, an enlarged area of the beck, probably with some form of now lost sluice, located on the truncated first channel to control the flow of water to the mill wheel of the very first corn mill, the one swept away in 1380. Perhaps the main flow of Asby Beck was held back by a weir, now also lost, which may have been where I've placed those words "a lost weir" just below second channel to the right. Today the beck is very shallow at this point and falls steeply. The bed here may consist of stones which once made up the weir, whereas the bed of the beck immediately to the west of those stones, also marked on the screenshot, appears to have been deepened in the manner typically used in the construction of medieval weir-retained mill ponds. After it had been used to drive the now lost first mill, the water would probably have been returned to the beck by way of a short tail race, probably not too far downstream. When the replacement mill was built, much further downstream at some point after 1380, the second channel, as I'm labelling it here, which was the beginning of that new, much longer mill race, was constructed to carry water to that replacement mill. My view is that the first channel was then closed off. However, I think it can still be detected as an area of ground within the wood on the northern bank of the beck that soon floods after heavy rain. I also believe that a stone structure with a sluice gate was built to control the flow of water to the new second channel. Let's see if we can show the positions of these features, albeit rather crudely, on our Google Earth image. Here, marked red, is the line of the first channel, which I believe was the line of the mill race for the pre-1380 mill. The yellow line is where the bed of the beck appears to have been deepened, with the flow of the beck held back by a weir where the red pin is positioned. The yellow pin marks the position of the sluice I believe was constructed to control water entering the second channel, the pale blue line here, which we could, of course, continue all the way to the replacement mill site, downstream at Asby Mill. There would probably have been additional structures further down the line of this channel to manage and control the flow of the water for its various uses, driving the bark mill at Millmoor and so on. However, I think we can still find some evidence of that sluice which controlled the flow of water to what I'm calling the second channel. I've marked its position here with a yellow pin. The beck is flowing from left to right in the foreground. The second channel I've spoken of runs beyond the fallen stonework we can see above the waterline. Hidden away, much of the stonework of this structure has collapsed. An elderly resident of Great Asby, Mick MacNaughton, remembers running along the coping stones of it as a young lad in the 1940s and jumping across a gap where the sluice gate may once have been. Mick remembers this as a neat structure, but the coping stones he once ran across have now fallen into the beck. On this extract from the 1897 second edition of the Ordnance Survey map, there appears to be a second or a more modern sluice structure on what I've called the second channel, closer to Marble Mill. I've ringed it on this extract from the map. By the time of the next edition of the Ordnance Survey map in 1915, that sluice is still there in the same position, but a new channel has been constructed roughly south of the sluice. Again, I've circled this in red, which would carry water back to the beck when the sluice was closed. The mill race appears to have been culverted close to the south gable of Marble Mill, and perhaps beneath the road as well, to reappear in that gateway to Millmoor close to the present-day bridge, which we looked at in part 2. This bridge replaced the ford that is shown on this map. The ford is shown here, not far to the right of the red circle, just beyond the FB or footbridge. Other labelling on the OS map may be a little confusing. The Marble Mill I've been talking about is actually the building on the right. The map label for it, shown here, is closer to the structure now known as Marble Mill Barn. In more recent times, the flow of water to the mill race was blocked off completely, but the channel which returned water to the beck, marked on the 1915 OS map we've just looked at, remains to this day. And here we see it, emerging from beneath the branches of trees behind Marble Mill Barn and Marble Mill, where the beginning of that second channel, probably constructed, as I've said, sometime after the destruction of the first corn mill in 1380, still flows. Before we leave to move further westwards, towards the village, to try to piece together a little more of the jigsaw of local water power management, let's take another look at the building called Marble Mill. Its name almost certainly derives from a relatively short-lived marble polishing operation dating to just before the middle years of the 19th century. Polished fossiliferous British limestones, designed to compete with imported Italian marble, enjoyed a period of fashionability, particularly around the time of the Great Exhibition of 1851. The production of polished limestone would have required a great deal of water to operate saws and polishing equipment. However, it's not at all certain that water carried by that mill race we've just looked at, and which passed close to the south gable of this building, the very gable we're looking at, it's not certain that this water ever powered any machinery within the building. This extract from the tithe map appears to show a channel of water in a quite different position. Here you see it, with a small red arrow pointing to it, running north-south, parallel to the western wall or rear of Marble Mill. Although it connects with the channel of the mill race, it would have been running into it, not out of it, as the ground here is higher than where the mill race flows. Another resident of Great Asby, the late Derek Gibbons, recalled his work done many years ago to replace a timber floor on the ground floor of Marble Mill. Beneath the floor was a stone channel, which looked as if it had once carried water, but, like the channel you see on screen, it too was on a north-south axis. Perhaps water power for Marble Mill for its marble polishing came from an as yet unidentified source, somewhere to the north of the building. Efforts will continue to try to identify it. Virtually no documentary evidence of activity at Marble Mill has been found. A county directory of 1849, which mentions a copper mine in the parish of Asby, adds that this mine, and I'll use the directory's words, proved unsuccessful, as has also a marble mill, which was erected here a few years ago by John Hill, Esquire. You will recall that John Hill was the lord of the manor of Asby Winderwath at this time, and it's possible that more about Marble Mill may eventually be found in his papers. However, the apparently small scale of the venture at Marble Mill and its short life may be indicated by information in the census records for Asby Parish. The 1841 census lists just one marble polisher and one marble mason living in the parish. And by the next census, 10 years later of course, nobody in the parish is listed as working with marble. A building immediately to the north of Marble Mill has been converted into a dwelling called Marble Mill Barn. No structure is shown in this position on the 1843 tithe map, but it does appear on the first edition of the 6-inch Ordnance Survey map, surveyed in 1856-7. It may have been omitted in error from the tithe map, but perhaps it's more likely that it was constructed by John Hill after 1843 as part of the development of his unsuccessful marble polishing venture. Marble Mill Barn houses a large iron pump. Perhaps that had some part to play in the movement of water around this rather puzzling site. Later, when we go to the parish church, we'll look at one or two pieces of polished limestone in there, which may have been products of the marble mill venture. Anne Newell Hill, who provided the funds to rebuild the church, was the heir of John Hill and may have had access to some of its surviving unsold products. There is also a fireplace of polished limestone in the rectory. That too may have been a product of Marble Mill. For now, let's continue our journey westwards to pick up the story of related water management arrangements slightly further upstream. If we stop before we reach Campbell's Garage, just right of the centre of the screen, there are a couple of things to point out here, which you can see if you look down towards the line of the beck with Butts Green on the far bank. Where I've placed the label Asby Beck was, if you remember, pretty much the location of the mill pond. The first thing to notice, marked with a thin pale blue line, is a narrow channel going across the field and running into Asby Beck. I believe that this narrow channel was the tail race of a much earlier mill in the manor of Asby Coatsford, the manor we're now walking through. I'll say more about that mill in a moment. The second thing we're going to look for here is a bank, a retaining bank, marked on the screen as a red line between the tail race and Asby Beck, a bank which ran along the south side of the mill pond. Here is a view of that retaining bank from ground level. We can see reinforcing stones have been incorporated into its outer face. They're slightly more visible to the left of the photograph. And you can make out the line of the top of the bank as it runs diagonally to the right towards the trees in the distance. At some later point, the narrow tail race channel, the pale blue line, which I've drawn a bit too close to the eastern or right-hand end of the mill pond, seems to have been used to create a safety feature which took water from the mill pond back into the beck to a point beyond whatever kind of weir held back the natural flow of the beck. That weir was part of that combination of water management features that we looked at a little while ago. It looks as if this safety feature was created by constructing another short connecting channel, marked dark blue just below centre screen, running from the back of the mill pond. As you can see, I put the approximate outline of the pond, based on the tithe map, back into this image. This safety feature may have been created to prevent an excessive build-up of water in the mill pond, and despite the fact that the mill seems to have been moved to a safer position further downstream, the safety feature was designed to prevent any repeat of what had happened in that great flood of 1380. It has not been possible to find any evidence on the ground of whatever sluice mechanism was used to divert water into this safety channel. Before we move on from this field, it's important to mention one other feature. Close to where the two channels of this probable safety feature meet is what seems to be a purposeful assemblage of a number, perhaps a dozen or so, of large, roughly worked stones at the head of a small ditch. The stones are 2 rows wide and 2 rows deep, approximately 30 inches across and 18 inches in depth, with clear spring water, sometimes more than 1 foot deep, beneath and in front of it. As you can see from this photograph, for much of the year it is concealed by vegetation. It is located very close to what the Ordnance Survey lists as St. Thomas's Well. Nothing is known of its history or reasons for its association with St. Thomas. And which St. Thomas might it be? there's a total of 20 St. Thomases to choose from. This may be a slightly daft piece of speculation on my part, but could it be St. Thomas a Becket, assassinated at Canterbury in December 1170? Here's my thinking. One of Becket's assassins was Hugh de Morville, Earl of Westmoreland. In his position as Earl of Westmoreland, Asby Manors would have been held of Hugh by their tenants. The tenant of Asby Coatsford Manor at this time, Alan de Lascelles, is said to have been a particularly close associate of de Morville. The site of St. Thomas's Well, this well, is in Asby Coatsford Manor. Is it possible that the dedication of a well to St. Thomas Becket was a small act of atonement for the assassination, perhaps made on de Morville's behalf by de Lascelles? Now this idea could be even dafter than the Da Vinci Code, and my scant thoughts about it even more badly written, but I leave it with you. Close to where we've stopped, near Campbell's Garage, the garage buildings are in the background in this photograph, is this sign pointing to a narrow road leading to Goodley Hill, to Lordmire, and eventually to Wygill. This narrow road, called Kelly Bank Lane, was mistakenly recorded by the first Ordnance Survey as Kelly Bark Lane, with an R instead of an N. The correct name, Kelly Bank with the N, probably derives from the Old Norse word kelda, spring or well, and the Middle English bank, slope or slope of a hill. The site of a spring, tautologically called Keld Well, is recorded about 450 yards, 411 metres or so, along this lane. Only a little further on, if we look over the wall beyond Campbell's Garage, but immediately before the road junction, we'll be able to see those lumps and bumps which we first looked at from that bench seat close to Moor Plantation. The lumps and bumps are marked here with a yellow pin, close to the Campbell's Garage label, near the centre of the screen. We'll go on to a road junction which we see clearly at the centre of the screen. Near this junction we can look over a gate, northwestwards, over hundreds of years of landscape history, to see, as you now know, the site of medieval water management channels, the medieval and early modern archery practice ground of Butts Green, and the 19th century plantation, Moor Plantation. We're now going to follow the road down a gentle slope into the main settlement of Great Asby. When we reach the foot of this slope, we'll pause at another field gate next to a small pumping station inside a fenced enclosure. That pumping station is marked with a red pin just below the centre of the screen, across the road from Town End Farm. We'll look to the right over a wooden fence to seek that narrow tail race, the one marked by the pale blue line. We're looking towards the tail race from that small fenced enclosure around the pumping station. You can see the line of the tail race going pretty much straight from the camera towards the dry stone wall in the mid-distance. Remember, we speculated that this was probably the tail race of the corn mill of Asby Coatsford Manor, taking its water back into Asby Beck. Try to hold on to that thought about the corn mill of Asby Coatsford Manor for a few moments longer. Right now we're going to follow the road a very little further west from the pumping station until we reach the first house. It's a small farmhouse called, as you can see at centre screen, Town End. The name simply describes its position at the lower end of the village or township. The higher end of the settlement, if you remember, is known as Town Head. We can see that a large bank barn has been added at the eastern end, that's the far end in this photograph, perhaps an earlier house. Indeed, from inside this bank barn, it's possible to see an even earlier, steeper line of the roof in the east gable of the farmhouse, indicating the steeper rake which that roof would have had when it was thatched. With barns and houses in a linear farmstead arrangement like this one, being built and rebuilt at different times, it's not unusual in Cumbria to find a taller, substantial barn dominating a lower, ridged house. On the lower floor of this town end barn, at the time when this video was being made in 2024, there survived some of the structures to be found within an old cow byre, in particular these boskins, dividing the stalls or booses, within which usually 2 cattle were tethered. The boskins here are made of large pieces of slate, held within timber frames with what are called heel posts connected to a spinal beam. A rudster, a vertical post to which each animal would be tethered, survives at the left side of the nearest boskin, and the top of another is visible beyond it. Above here would have been a hayloft, accessed by a ramped entry. At last, about 35 yards or 32 metres beyond Town End, is the probable site of that Asby Coatsford corn mill I've mentioned, and have kept asking you to remember. At ground level at this site, we can see a little of the remains of a building which once stood here. Marked with a rough hand-drawn red arrow, more or less at the centre of the photograph, these coins in what is now the garden wall of a cottage appear to be all that remains of a building which village folk memory recalls as a corn mill. If that folk memory is correct, then it would almost certainly have once been the site of the corn mill of the manor of Asby Coatsford. It was a building, perhaps having been rebuilt many times, which stood until well into the second half of the 20th century. That building was captured in this postcard photograph, likely to date from shortly before the First World War. But it probably ceased to function as a corn mill many, many years before that. In the 1843 tithe apportionment documents, the building on this site is simply described as a barn, and it could be many hundreds of years since milling took place here. The camera is looking down the road in the same direction westwards as we're travelling. The Methodist Chapel of 1859 can be seen in the middle distance, on the right, partially obscured by a tree or shrub, and the porch of Town End farmhouse can be seen in the foreground, on the left. Nearby, we can find other evidence of water management associated with this mill. Diagonally across the road from the coins in the garden wall, in front of the southern boundary walls of 2 cottage gardens, is this carefully made stone channel. Probably it was the first part of the tail race from the mill, carrying the water eastwards and eventually into that watercourse marked as a pale blue line on the screen, and which we saw at ground level from the pumping station enclosure only moments ago. The supply of water which once powered this Asby Coatsford mill appears to have been carefully managed. Coloured red towards the centre of the screen, we can see the approximate lines of 2 channels of water which used to flow here. The one on the right is west of a property called Park View. That on the left is just east of Asby Hall. Both were then channelled east towards the mill. An open gutter carrying this water survived into the 1980s, but later flooding problems caused by these old water channels led to them being redirected through a culvert northwards across Chapel Green in front of the Methodist Chapel and into Asby Beck. Older residents of the village recall water passing beneath the floor of this mill building before it went under the road and across into that stone channel that we looked at in front of the cottages. There are those cottages on the right in this image, camera side of the back of the Methodist Chapel, which is just across the road from the site of the mill building. The arrangement, as it is remembered, of water passing beneath the floor of this building raises the intriguing possibility that it may once have housed what is called a horizontal mill. In this arrangement, a wheel laid horizontally and shown bottom left of centre was turned by the flow of water coming in from the right in this drawing to drive, without gearing, a vertical shaft which turned the upper of two millstones placed on a floor above the wheel. This type of mill is relatively early, perhaps from the 10th century, and tended to be used on small but reliable sources of water. The milling capacity was limited, not much greater than that of a hand quern. So if this was the Asby Coatsford mill, it may have fallen into disuse at quite an early date as the population grew, and some alternative arrangement was made to grind corn. Perhaps at that first Asby Winderwath mill, where the tenants of that manor helped to make the mill pond in the 12th century. Or at what I have suggested was the replacement mill, built further downstream. The distribution of any surviving horizontal mills is largely confined to Ireland and the Scottish Islands, but archaeological evidence suggests they may have been more widely spread. Indeed, there's a possibility that there was another local mill of this type on another small but reliable water source at Gaythorne Hall, only a couple of miles to the west of Great Asby. The stones, at least, of the old mill building here went on to further use. They were incorporated into the foundations of some of the buildings which make up the Campbell's Garage complex that we passed a few moments ago just up the road. Across the road from the mill site, and across the centuries, is a building we've already mentioned, and which was the product of marked changes in 18th and 19th century English society and religious practice. This building is the Methodist Chapel. In the 18th and 19th centuries, large numbers in the population began to become members of the so-called non-conformist churches. By the time of the religious census of 1851, of those attending services on that census day in Westmoreland, nearly 15% were Methodists and 1.7% were Baptists. Earlier in our perambulation of the village, we passed the Baptist Chapel, established in 1863. This Methodist chapel was founded a few years earlier. In 1859, as this date stone on the southern gable shows. Built at a cost of £300, according to Bulmer's County Directory of 1885, it was able to accommodate 140 worshippers. Unfortunately, none of the local newspapers appears to contain any report about the construction of the building or its opening for worship. The area in front of the chapel is known as Chapel Green. As we've already touched on, common land in the manor of Asby Coatsford, known as Asby Mask, was enclosed by Act of Parliament in 1847. but the enclosure commissioners declared this common land in front of the chapel, as they would similarly declare Butts Green in Asby Winderwath Manor, nearly 30 years later, and I quote, a place for exercise and recreation for the inhabitants of the said township and neighbourhood. And it was to be, and I quote again, repaired and maintained by and at the expense of the churchwardens and overseers of the poor. Looking on to Chapel Green are some early 21st century dwellings constructed around 2004-2005. Asby Hall Mews. Prior to the construction of these houses, the pinfold of Asby Coatsford Manor was here. Remember, we saw the surviving gate stoops of Asby Winderwath Manor pinfold earlier in our journey. Before its destruction, this Asby Coatsford pinfold had a second life as an enclosure for sheep, awaiting their pre-clipping wash in Asby Beck. Right next door to Asby Mews is Asby Hall. Its name is shown here above the main building, almost at the centre of the screen. At the start of our perambulation, we noted the probability that Asby was once a single manor. There is no evidence of manorial halls in 2 of the 3 manors into which that single manor was later divided. This isn't unusual, as many non-resident holders of manors didn't need a manor house. We also noted that the now lost Winder Hall on Sale Lane almost certainly took its name from the family name Winder, found in manorial and parish records of the 17th and 18th centuries, and not from the name of the manor of Asby Winderwath. So it seems reasonable to conclude that Asby Hall here was probably the manorial hall of that first single manor of Asby, and the clue may be in its name. Some historians argue that in the Eden Valley, manorial halls are typically located in the southeast corner of settlements, and that is where this building is placed. Let's take a look at ground level. The hall is positioned behind a low wall with some fine railings of the 18th or some say mid-19th century. The present building has a date stone of 1694 with the initials E.M. These initials, E at top left and M at top right of the coat of arms in this rather poor quality image for which I apologise, are almost certainly those of Edward Musgrave. The 16 and the 94 of the date are at the bottom left and the bottom right of the coat of arms. We know that an Edward Musgrave died in Asby in 1699. His will survives. And it is probably he who did some major rebuilding here, 5 years before his death. The house was enlarged in the mid-18th century, but part of the footprint of an earlier, smaller building can be seen. Perhaps it immediately preceded the rebuilding marked by this date stone. Some evidence of that earlier, smaller building is in the remains of a plinth at the foot of the gable walls, some of it concreted over. This snowy photograph shows the plinth at the east gable. A plinth was a platform of foundation stones. The dimensions of the plinth show that it was about half the depth of the present house. The presence of plinth stones in both gables suggests that the earlier structure was probably the same length as the present one, although we don't know what form it took. Was it all domestic space in the form of, say, a cross-passage hall, or was it a linear farmstead? These agricultural buildings on the western side of the space in front of the hall have been converted into holiday cottages, but it's still possible to see evidence of what looks like a barn range with attached animal houses, probably mid-18th century with later additions. We can also see evidence of wagon doorways from its days of agricultural use. One is just left of centre of this range and two towards the right gable end. The scale of the agricultural activity of this grand farmstead is reflected in the surveyor's report made about it for the 1910 Land Valuation Survey. In their publication, Great Asby, A Guide to the Village 100 Years Ago, that booklet, which can be purchased at the Bar of the Three Greyhounds, Valerie Mandelson and Graham Parkin point to surveyor's notes from 1910. Those notes state that the house contained a cheese-making room and dairy. On the first floor were 5 bedrooms, and on the second floor, and you can see the windows of rooms on all 3 floors in this photograph, 6 rooms were used to store wool. When wool was still a valuable commodity, sadly in most cases no longer true, it was important to keep it safe within the house. At the western end of the railings in front of the hall, you will see this churn stand, where large metal milk containers called churns would have been left for collection. Along with a number of other structures in and around villages, this is an example of what the heritage industry calls small-scale heritage features. A survey of these village features was completed by the Westmoreland Dales Landscape Partnership, and it offers another layer at which you can examine Great Asby. To see details of the many features that were found, go to the Asby Parish website, go to Interests and select History Group on the drop-down menu. Scroll down the History Group page to find past projects and select Small Scale Heritage Survey. From a field behind Asby Hall, pretty much bottom centre right, there is a record of an interesting archaeological find in 2006. It's a copper alloy strap end which was submitted to what is known as the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which aims to identify and record casual archaeological finds, many of course made by detectorists. The base of the strap end is flat and extends into what is perceived as an open-work phallic design. At one corner of the base there projects a small hoop at a 90-degree angle, which would have attached the object to a strap. This photograph shows both sides of the strap end, and you can see that projecting hoop at the bottom left in the left-hand photograph and at top left in the photograph on the right. The Portable Antiquities Scheme staff were unable to find a similar strap end in any reference material, and the find has been dated as being possibly Roman, hence the question mark in the title on this photograph, due to the nature of its design and in particular the phallic shape. Of course, it isn't evidence that there was a Roman military presence in Great Asby. Roman artefacts would have found their way to a number of locations through trade and other distribution processes, which would probably have continued long after the former military occupation had come to an end. Nonetheless, what is probably a tiny fragment of the Roman Empire lay here. Let's continue our journey westwards. Immediately next door to Asby Hall is the substantial field, its size reflected in its name, Broadgarth. You can see that name at top right of the screen. It incorporates the Old Norse word Gartha, G-A-R, then a letter called eth, which is pronounced as the, then finally an R, which means the whole word is pronounced Gartha. It means enclosure, and it long ago entered the dialect of this area and beyond. It's difficult to know if this was demesne land, that means farmed directly by the lord of the manor, the occupant of Asby Hall, and which therefore never had any manorial tenants' house plots on it, or if it's an area from which house plots were lost during a period of depopulation because of disease or famine, or during economic decline. Some argue that there is evidence of lumps and bumps on the surface of the ground here, suggesting that there were once house platforms. Although there are now other buildings, including the village hall, the endowed school and the 3 Greyhounds Inn, between this field and the rectory, further to the west, you can see them all marked on the screen in a shallow arc to the left of Broadgarth. All of these buildings are relatively recent, and they occupy what was probably at one time all glebe-land, something that we talked about when we were looking in more detail at the 3 Greyhounds at the beginning of part 1. Glebe-land, if you remember, was assigned to support the local clergy. At the southern boundary of Broadgarth, towards centre right of the screen, there's evidence of the line of a back lane. This is a typical feature of so-called planned medieval villages. It was mentioned when we first set out on our journey. Back lanes ran behind the line of house-tofts and small crofts immediately behind them to give access to them and to longer crofts or even open fields beyond. In childhood memories of village residents in their 80s, styles which would have given access from this back lane to the croft fields were still in place. Here, in the manor of Asby Coatsford, the back lane ran behind the tofts of the linear farmsteads that we passed at the beginning of our journey. But it also continued eastwards, here behind Broadgarth and also behind Asby Hall. Might that be another clue that Broadgarth was actually the site of one or more farmsteads? Beyond the line of the back lane lies a field called Knipe Gate. It's called that on the 19th century tithe map. You can see it in the centre of the screen here. It gives us an amusing example of how field names change over time, even into present times. Its 19th century name probably reflects some previous association of the land with the Knipe family, which we know was a local surname in the late 16th century. We also know from Asby Winderwath Manor court book entries that it was common for a surname to be combined with the word gate, in the sense of the Norse word gata, meaning road or track. So this area may once have been the location of a track which led to land held by somebody called Knipe. But today, simply because of its shape, take another look at it. Local man Brian Park tells me it is known to some villagers as Banana Field. Archaeologists and historians would say, rather more sniffily, that it displays an lateral curve, evidence that it is a now enclosed medieval strip holding, with its shape sculpted by regular ploughing with ox teams, and then fossilised by its enclosing boundaries following the line of its ancient sculpted curve. Back to our main route. Running down the side of Broadgarth is Burney Beck Syke. It's at the top right of the screen, with the watercourse marked in a shade of blue which doesn't actually show up too well. At first sight, this appears to be one of those minor place names where additional elements have been added, perhaps when understanding of the meaning of original elements had been lost. It sounds as if it consists of 3 elements, Burney, Beck and Syke, where each of them might mean a watercourse of some kind. But in this case, the Burney element probably has nothing to do with an upland stream. Instead, it's more likely that it derives from an Old English or Middle English word, begazen or beganes, which means cairn or heap of stones. And the beck may have acquired this element in its name because early in its course it's close to the stony remains of the Romano-British settlement of Holborn Hill, located a little over a mile to the south of here. We briefly glimpsed its location when we journeyed out into Asby Coatsford's town fields at the start of part 1. This word, Burney, probably has the same root as Bourne in that minor place name Holborn. We'll tolerate a few seconds of silence to enable you to finish reading the information box on the screen before we move on. The next major building on our left, beyond Burney Beckside, is the village hall, almost certainly built at the head of what would once have been a croft of Glebeland. Although it is now called the village hall, when it was constructed in 1908, it was the Conservative Club. It made the transition to village hall status, free of any political connection, in order to be eligible for national lottery funding in the late 20th century. Now, on to our last stopping point before we reach the end of our circuit of the village. The village school, or Asby Endowed School, like the village hall and 3 Greyhounds Inn, is, as I've already said, almost certainly built at the head of a glebe croft. Asby Free School, as it was called when it began life, was established in 1682 on the basis of income from property at Raisbeck in the parish of Orton, granted by Thomas Smith, who was at that time Dean of Carlisle. Later, in 1688, that date is shown on this commemoration stone, a further grant of land to provide additional income for the school was made by George Smith, believed to be a cousin of Thomas, and described as merchant, tailor and citizen of London on this 19th century stone, placed on this building, which replaced what was probably the first structure, destroyed by fire in the 1850s. Thomas Smith had been born in 1615 at the farmstead of White Wall, a mile or so to the west of Great Asby, son of John Smith, a yeoman farmer. As I've just said, Thomas was Dean of Carlisle at the time of his gift to the school in 1682, but 2 years later he would become bishop, succeeding Edward Rainbow. The names of the fields granted by George Smith in 1688 are set down in a contemporary document. All of them were within the parish of Asby, and the location of each of them has been identified. In 1688, in parts of the townlands or common fields of Asby Windworth and Asby Coatsford Manors, they had names such as Bertree Acre, Gilland, Trowlands and Coulterlands. But 145 years later, when the mid-19th century parish tithe map was surveyed, they had each acquired the much more prosaic label of school land. Joseph Clement, the famous 19th century precision tool engineer, whom we spoke of when looking at the old smithy in part 2, would have been a pupil in the first school building on this site, the building which burned down in the middle of the 19th century. And so we return to our starting point. That starting point was, of course, the 3 Greyhounds Inn. On your own real walk around the village, this may be the time to step inside, perhaps to rest for a while, before going back over the bridge to visit the church of St. Peter. But we'll go over this bridge straight away and pass through the listed Lich Gate into the churchyard. The Lich Gate probably dates from the rebuilding of the church in the 1860s, but it's just been very skillfully replaced using oak timbers. We'll make a brief visit into the church itself, not so much to look in detail at its structure, but instead to examine 1 or 2 features that connect with buildings and people we've encountered on our walk around the village. The late Ronald Blythe once wrote, and I quote, "Churches are stories that one can actually enter. The church is the most history-soaked artefact in the possession of a community. a house of words as well as of wood and stone. But with the demolition and replacement of the old St. Peter's Church, this parish community lost a significant part of its story. For that church may well have been a pre-conquest structure with a very ancient story. However, some grave slabs and memorials from the old church were incorporated into the new structure or have been placed nearby. So, something of the house of words, to use Blythe's phrase, does survive. Let's take a look. In the floor of this wintry-looking south porch of the church is a large blue limestone grave slab. It has matrices for the brasses of a pair of figures, a man in civil dress and a woman in a butterfly headdress, together with 4 shields and an indecipherable inscription. It is believed to be late 15th century, and may represent a lord and lady of the manor of that time. Sadly, nothing more, and there is no way of knowing for certain the names of local figures it may have been associated with. Is its suggested date of the late 15th century, probably based on the butterfly headdress, too late for the memorial to be thought to feature 2 of the Moresby family, who were lords of the manor of Asby earlier in the 15th century. Let's enter the porch to try to find some connections we can make. Just before you reach the church door, at around shoulder height on your left, is a small, well-worn brass plate, which seems to have once indicated the location of the grave of a William Powley, who died on August the 2nd, 1768, aged 86, and of his wife Agnes, who died in November 1741, aged 66. Near this place lies the body, are the first words we read here. So it's possible that this brass plate once marked a place of burial within the old church. For at least 42 years, from 1721 to 1763, William Powley was parish clerk of Asby, and this service may have been honoured by burial within the body of the church. Brian Looms, an historian of clockmaking, presents a convincing case that this same William Powley was one of the famous Powley family of Great Asby, whose members were producing very fine clocks from the early 18th century. But by the later part of that century, they were working from Appleby. Looms also refers to documentary evidence, but sadly gives no source, in the form of a report by a local mining surveyor written in 1755, where it stated that the Powleys dug out all the copper that they used and smelted it themselves to produce brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc, of course, for the faces of their clocks. The source of the copper they mined may well have been old workings which can still be seen immediately to the north of Copper Mines Lane, west of the village, on the road to Gaythorne Plain. Immediately to your right, on the other side of the porch, is another small brass plaque, which probably also once marked a grave. "Here lieth the body," are its first words. That would be the grave of this 18th century rector, Joshua Burrow, commemorated by this plaque, who held that position from 1727 to 1739. He too had probably been buried within the church. By this date, the date of Burrow's burial, the old church no longer had an earth floor. It was replaced by a stone one around 1703-1704, but burials within the building must have remained possible. Although burial within churches had become rarer after the Reformation, the practice varied between parishes. By 1800 it had become very rare, but both plaques we have looked at refer to burials which took place at least 3 decades before that date. One previous rector of the parish, in the late 1940s, Hugh Prince, offered the view that the new church had been built on the foundations of the old so as to minimise disturbance of the graves of those who had been buried under the floor of the old church. Burials within churches were finally banned by the Burials Acts of the 1850s. We'll enter the church. Once through the door, if we turn to our left, we find this large plaque on the south wall. It commemorates the Fair brothers, William and Joseph, as well as Anne, William's wife. The 2 brothers were founders, if you recall from part 2, of the almshouses next to St. Helen's Well. This is, of course, another of the memorials and artefacts that survive from the old church building. It seems likely that the almshouses project was taken forward by Joseph as a memorial to his brother, who died in 1811. Going on to the west wall of the church, we see 2 framed documents which refer to the Simon Pindar Bread Charity. Pindar had been born in the parish and, worthy of note perhaps, had been baptised in the old St. Peter's on Christmas Day 1676. He went on to become the rector of nearby Great Musgrave from 1719 to 1755. The document in the upper frame is a copy of what was believed to be a letter in Pindar's own handwriting, undated, but which set up a charity to provide, every Sunday, 6 twopenny loaves. Here we see the characteristics of the 6 people to whom those loaves were to be given. 6 of the most indigent persons, male or female, legally settled in that parish, that's Asby of course, being members of the Church of England and constantly attending divine service. Note all those conditions, as well as an echo of the poor laws of the time in the phrase, legally settled in that parish. You can read all the details in the transcription of Pindar's letter in the lower of the 2 frames on the church wall, which we saw a couple of moments ago. Eventually, and somewhat ironically perhaps, given that reference to legally settled, the Pindar bequest was almost fully used up as a desperate measure in 1796 to save Asby Parish from extreme financial difficulties. Those difficulties had been caused by large legal expenses incurred in a dispute with Barnet Castle to determine in which of the 2 parishes a particular pauper family, the Leightons, were legally settled. Go back now to the south wall of the church and go towards the altar. On that south wall you will see a rather worn memorial plaque for a Roger Pindar, who died on August the 27th, 1776. He was probably a nephew of the Simon Pindar, who created the bread charity. Next to that memorial to Roger Pindar is another from the 18th century. Along with other members of the Bowness family who lived at Town End Farm, where we looked into the old cow byre, remember, with its buskins and rudsters, this plaque commemorates 3 brothers, George, John and Robert Bowness, who are described as merchants and traders in Virginia. That's colonial Virginia, of course, prior to the American War of Independence. We can trace a little of their lives in the local tax records of Norfolk, Virginia, and in Virginia newspapers of the time. The earliest mention of John Bowness is in 1759, and limited records of the brothers go through to 1780. These include a list of tithables. A tithable was a person who paid tax for themselves or paid it on behalf of another. and they are recorded for the year 1778, the year in which John Paul Jones, perhaps the best-known American naval commander of the War of Independence, led an attack on the Cumbrian port of Whitehaven, perhaps the very port from which the Bo'ness brothers had set sail for Virginia. They appear to have been tea traders and perhaps tobacco exporters as well, and owners of a small number of slaves. Their time in Virginia spanned, of course, the outbreak of the War of Independence. Records and newspaper reports of the time indicate that they were pro-British or loyalist, and it appears that at one point the lands of the two brothers were seized by the new revolutionary government in Virginia under a Confiscation Act, which gave them the right to seize loyalist land and property. We lose track of the final fate of the Bo'ness brothers, but it seems likely that the hopes that they carried with them when they set out for Virginia from Great Asby were not fulfilled, and by the time their mother died in 1790, all three were already dead, almost certainly dying in America. Given the ubiquitous presence of slavery and economic activity of the 18th century, we shouldn't be surprised to find evidence of it in the lives of these Asby men who headed off to colonial America. One classical study, Capitalism and Slavery, observes that by 1750 there was hardly a trading or manufacturing town here in England which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade. As many will be aware, the moral and economic relationships between English society and slavery are complex, contentious ones, and not something we have the time or space to explore in this setting. Some would argue that we should not expect people who lived in the 18th century to have been able to refuse their era's imperatives, incentives, and economic logic. We find slavery resurfacing, so to speak, in this church building nearly 80 years later, in the wealth of the woman who rebuilt it, Anne Newell Hill of Putney. It appears that some of her wealth was inherited through her mother from her grandmother, Anne Newell of Southampton, who owned the Red Hazel and Hermitage plantations near Kingston in Jamaica, which together held up to 329 enslaved people. Anne Newell Hill's mother, who had inherited at least one of these estates from her mother, received an estimated, measured in today's values, £374,000 in compensation as a slave owner following the abolition of slavery in 1834. Let's walk now to the pulpit. Immediately below the pulpit, in a wheeled metal frame made by steel fabricators at Campbell's Garage, which we passed earlier, is the grave slab of Thomas de Annandale, another rector of Asby, from 1343 until his death in 1374. In his will, he desired burial in the old church, so the present location of the slab is probably not too far from where it was first placed. You may also recall that it was Thomas's will which gives us the somewhat puzzling name of Patrick's Bridge for the old church bridge. Because in that will, amongst a number of generous bequests, he left one mark, 13 shillings and fourpence, for the maintenance of, and I remind you of the Latin words of his will, Ponti Patrici de Ascaby. While we're here, let's look for possible examples of products of Marble Mill. I mentioned them earlier when we stopped to look at that building. A marble mill was established here, if you recall, by John Hill around the late 1830s or early 1840s. It had probably ceased production by 1849. We mentioned when we first passed by this building that during its short working life, the mill would have been producing polished fossiliferous limestone for use, amongst other purposes, in the construction of fireplaces. Two fireplaces, which survive in the rectory, are almost certainly constructed from Asby marble. It was John Hill's relative, his heir as Lady of the Manor, Anne Newell Hill, who, as we've just mentioned, financed the construction of this new church during the 1860s. Perhaps the pieces of polished limestone, to be found in various places around the church, are products of this mill established by John Hill. Here we see some pieces forming short pilasters on the pulpit, but there may be other examples on the font and the sides of the chancel arch. Before you leave this end of the church, walk into the choir and look up to the south wall to find a memorial to the Reverend Guy, who we met, so to speak, together with some of his family when we looked at Croft House in part 1. Along with Henry Guy, this memorial mentions his wife and two of their children, Margaret, the mother of the Elizabeth Guy, who was living at Croft House in 1881, and his son, also Henry, and also living at Croft House in that same year, but who died 3 years later. Turn now and walk back towards the organ at the west end of the church, but keep looking at the north wall. Just before you reach the organ, on that north wall, you will see a watercolour, said to have been painted by Anne Newell Hill herself, of the old St. Peter's Church. Go on a little further, and you will come to a photograph. You may recall this photograph from when we passed by that plaque in the churchyard wall in part 2, the plaque which commemorates the extension of the churchyard in 1919. This photograph shows the men who took part in that boom day of work. As I said then, there is little evidence here of social distancing in response to the Spanish flu pandemic, which was raging at that time. In this photograph on the wall of the church, you can also read the family names of each of the men. Among them, Sowerby, Bainbridge, Park and Taylor. Surnames you will still find in the village and its surrounding farms. We'll walk on towards the south door of the church. Before passing through the doorway, look down to find another memorial, this sandstone slab in the floor just at the eastern side of the door. The inscription appears to be the initials GT, and the year is 1694. This is undoubtedly the grave slab of George Theobald, rector of Asby from 1661 until his death in 1694. His burial is recorded in the parish register as having taken place on April the 10th of that year. Theobald, or Tybald as he was sometimes known, was rector at the time when the Smith cousins endowed Asby School. You may recall seeing one of their names on the wall of the school building. Theobald's name was also preserved for quite a long time in the name of one of the fields granted to provide additional income for the school. Up to the early 19th century, one of these school fields on the western margins of the enclosed farmland of the parish was still known as Theobald's. It was during Theobald's time as rector, in 1670, that Lady Anne Clifford, or Anne Pembroke, sheltered in the rectory with all her retinue when caught in a thunderstorm, and stayed overnight. For this kindness, it is said, Lady Anne made a gift to Theobald of this great stock lock and key. A number of similar locks, gifts from Lady Anne to other households, survive in Cumbria. This wooden lock, bearing the initials AP for Anne Pembroke, for she was married to the Earl of Pembroke, as you can see, is still preserved in the village, but it is not on public display. I'm grateful to Margaret Dickinson of Cumbria magazine for this image. Folk memory suggests that the lock was never actually attached to the door of the rectory. Let's go outside the church to find another memory of Theobald's family. Once outside, look opposite the church porch to see this large sandstone slab lying on its side and propped against the southern wall of the churchyard. Because it's on its side, you can see the top of the wall to the left of the slab. It appears to be the grave slab of one of the daughters of George Theobald. This was one of his married daughters, Elizabeth, married to a William Richardson of Little Asby. She, when aged 13 or 14, would have been one of George Theobald's surviving children, left motherless when his wife Anne died, giving birth to her 9th child, Mariana, who also died very shortly after her birth in late November 1670. The impact of Anne's death may have rippled on down the years. Later poor law records for Asby Parish give a very clear indication that her son, Edward, who would have been just 4 years old at the time of his mother's death, suffered what was undoubtedly a mental health breakdown in 1714 when he was a curate at Grey Rig. An incident which may point to the under-recorded impact on mental health of loss and grief associated with death in past centuries. But rather than end on this very melancholy note, let's look at the top of the church wall, just beyond the western end of Elizabeth's grave slab. Here you can see that grave slab at the left of this image. Incorporated into the wall is a piece of stonework, perhaps part of a cross from the old church. Resting on it is part of a sundial, its gnomon broken off, the copper of the dial with a green patina. Perhaps this is the sundial that the churchwarden's accounts for St. Peter's tell us was bought for 1 shilling in 1741. Perhaps it was also a product, who knows, of William Powley's craftsmanship in brass. Remember the brass plate to this clockmaker on our left at shoulder height as we entered the church door for the first time. His wife, Agnes, died in that year of 1741, so there may here be some forgotten connection with her death. On this note of the measuring of time and of forgotten connections with the dead, we end our slow and measured journey around the village, taking in Dale Green to the west and Marble Mill to the east. A journey that has tried to restore connections between what you see in today's villagescape with activities that have gone before, and also make some connections with people who have gone before. We hope you've learned a little more about the fabric of Great Asby, as well as a little more about some of its past residents. On our short walk, we've located an ancient trackway to prehistoric sites, but which was later used as a route for medieval ox ploughs and for priests moving between a pre-conquest church and a 13th century chantry chapel. We have passed the site where a Roman artefact was found. We have seen watery places which may have been sacred in prehistoric times and in the 12th century. We've traced the management of water power in the medieval and later landscape. We learned of a nearby Cistercian grange linking the parish landscape to the wool markets of Europe. We looked upon meadows that perhaps formed part of the payment for a manorial court officer. We found a beckside field where local longbowmen practised for battle from the medieval period through to early modern times. We inspected a structure which was probably a place of refuge for local clergy during a period of border warfare and skirmishes. We contemplated an inn which may take its unusual name from the coat of arms of a clergyman. We glimpsed local but short-lived foundations of industrial ventures into tanning and marble polishing established in the 18th and mid-19th centuries. We glanced at 2 places of learning for a very famous 19th century precision engineer born at Townhead in the village of Great Asby. We held in view a building which played a part in the water-powered generation of electricity for the village in the first half of the 20th century. We learned a little about the changing nature of the village housescape from the 12th century through to the present time, and anticipated how that process will continue. All of this is evidence, surely, of a many-layered landscape, which you may want to continue to explore. You can do so by joining us on future recorded walks. They will start in the village, but then go out along tracks and paths to explore more of the historic landscape which surrounds the village. All can be found on the Asby Parish website. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for watching.